A graphic novel, a TV show. Well, it's not TV, it's HBO. And will this thing succeed? And by how much, man? And some might cheer and some might scoff because it's Damon Lindelof. But either way, we're off to watch some Watchmen. Watching Watchmen, talking Watchmen, analyzing Watchmen, and maybe arguing over Watchmen.
Welcome to Watchmen Watch, a podcast about HBO's Watchmen. Who watches The Watchmen? We watch The Watchmen. Also, watch you watching The Watchmen. I'm Alex.
I'm Justin.
I am Pete. That's a lot of watching.
It is a lot of watching. Unfortunately, there's one person who isn't going to be watching this week. Justin, what's going on here?
Our fourth host, Alan Moore. He is usually here for this. I think he's been at all of them up until this one, but he just texted me. He can't make it. He's trapped in like the mid 80s, and so his Skype settings aren't working quite correctly.
This is the problem with having a guy who has the power of time travel on our podcast. It's very disappointing, but you know what? He's been a good friend. The other day I was feeling a little down, and he just appeared. He apparated, if you will, and said, "Hey, how you doing, buddy? You want to hang out? You want to get some PSLs?" And I was like, "Yeah, I want to get some PSLs." And he bought us the PSLs. Venti wow. PSLs. That's the kind of guy Alan Moore is.
Wow. That's good. He's a good friend, a great enemy, and a magnificent bastard.
Well, I'm very disappointed that he won't be here this week, but we will be talking about the third issue of the Watchmen comic book, The Judge of All the Earth, as we continue to ramp up to the debut of the HBO series on October 20th. Before we get into the issue, though, I want to confess something to you guys now that we're a couple of episodes into this podcast.
About time.
This podcast makes me very nervous.
Why?
And the reason it makes me very nervous is because Watchmen is so revered throughout our entire history as comic book reviewers, throughout the history of comic books, or at least the past couple of decades of comic book history. I feel, and I was curious to get your guys' bent on it, your guys' take on it, but I feel a responsibility to get everything right, and I'm terrified that people are going to point out things that we got hideously wrong. And normally I don't feel that on our podcast, but this one I definitely do. How are you guys feeling about it? Are you pretty chill about it, or are you feeling like I am?
Well, now I'm stressed. I feel like this is sort of getting into, it's like we're archaeologists digging up like a pretty sick dinosaur.
Yeah, like what's the sweetest dinosaur? I'm going to say Stegosaurus.
Yeah. And we have our fourth host, the king of the dinosaurs, here normally with us. So that's cool to dig up a dinosaur with the king of the dinosaurs.
That's rude to the man who bought me a Venti PSL with a nutmeg spritz on it, which was very nice. Pete, what about you? How are you feeling about this? How are you feeling about talking about Watchmen so far? I
feel like Watchmen has been talked about so much. It is such a huge... some people call it the grail of comic books, of graphic novels. I feel like we're just giving how we feel about it, our take on it, and that doesn't stress me out. But there is a weight to this, though, that is something to be revered.
Yeah. It also... it helps, but it doesn't help that, as we've been kind of joking about the past couple of episodes, it's a really good book. Like, we talked about this on a couple of episodes, but you sort of abstract how good Watchmen is over the years when you're talking about it. But getting back into it, and this issue, again, I was struck because we've been talking about juxtaposition quite a bit on the podcast, but this issue hits it real hard. Crazy hard, and the amount of effort and time and thought that goes into that Not that modern comic book writers and generally comic book writers aren't putting the thought, but the several extra levels that are going on there make it super impressive, and I feel it owed us to deliver on that in our podcast.
Yeah, I think, well, that's, if we want to talk about the things that really stand out on rereading this, like the pacing of this comic it's just so stunning, how the way it just moves through the story and really complex ideas and a series of different complex ideas.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about this issue because I thought this was a fascinating one. The first two issues of the book very squarely focus on the mystery of who killed Edward Blake as we continue to flesh out the characters, as we continue to flesh out the themes of this book. To my mind, at least on first read, on a very surface read, it feels like it almost takes a step back from that. You know, we get a lot of character move into this one. This is the one that introduces the tales of the Black Freighter. We get a lot of thematic resonance in terms of what's going on in the world. There's this literal doomsday clock counting down to the potential destruction of the world, the way that the people in the world think it's going to happen with the war between Russia and the United States, but they don't know they're going to get squidded. What did you guys think about this issue in general? What was your feeling on it?
Also, this to me is like we saw New York a lot in the first two issues, but this to me is like classic New York, you know, like especially the way it starts, like the guy in the street, you know, thinking he kind of knows everything because he lives in New York City and because of the things that he's seen. But
True.
I also love the detail. Like if you look at the stand and all the little things in the stand, that says so much about this comic that there is no just background fill-in stuff. Like everything is thought about. You can look at the titles of the magazines. You know, they take a shot at Richard Nixon in this. Plus, you have the thermos and the lunchbox, which just kind of brought me back, and I was like, "Oh man, I miss my thermos." I used to just like eat ramen out of my thermos, and like it was a good time.
Ramen, I mean, that's
ramen.
Yeah. You eat a noodle soup out of a thermos.
Yeah, man.
Did you? Sorry to hook into this too much, but Pete, did you like just slurp a bunch of noodles out there, or what was going on?
Yeah, man. Take off the cap, slurp some noodles. You don't need no utensils, man.
All right. I mean, that's one of the...
What year was this? Was this in a post-apocalyptic world?
Dude, I hate to break it to you. Ramen's been a while for a minute, bro. Especially instant ramen.
Do you know that bowls exist? Are you aware of that?
Yes, I am.
Oh, all right.
That'd be a crazy reveal. Pete's never even seen a bowl.
A what?
Let me describe it. It's like a plate with walls. Just if you don't know it, that's what a bowl is.
Yeah. Well, one of the major themes of the issue is that thermoses exist, and what do you think about that? And they really do a good job of the juxtaposition there. Well, let's talk through the major themes of the issue before we walk through anything. Yes, Pete.
Just real quick, though, I just wanted to say, because it's like, it starts... We talked about, and especially in the last issue, how they think about the panels kind of like a camera a little bit, and you're fully zoomed in on this Fallout Shelter sign, and zooms out as, you know, the newsstand guy's talking. And it's just about perspective, and that's a lot about what this comic is about, is perspective. And it's very interesting.
Well, specifically the Fallout Shelter sign, this plays out throughout this issue in particular because we're dealing with radioactivity in a bunch of different ways. There's first of all, there's the Fallout Shelter, as you mentioned, which I believe it doesn't show up on the first page, but it's revealed later on that the newsstand is across from the Institute of, I think it's Extraspatial Studies, which is, as we find out later on, where a certain squid appears towards the end of the series. So that's the actual danger. That's the actual fallout that's going to happen by the end of the series. You have the second radioactive fallout and the second instance of the radioactive fallout sign when it's put on Dr. Manhattan's door late in the issue when he is accused of irradiating people, giving them cancer. Whether that's true or not is certainly up for debate. I think I would argue it's pretty clear that he's not, but that's certainly another bit that we're dealing with the radioactivity, a potential danger thing that might be bubbling under the surface. And the last one is the war between Russia and the United States that we mentioned earlier as they invade Afghanistan. And there's this very satirical scene, I think, where Richard Nixon is in the war room and they're showing, this is what the nuclear fallout would be like if the Russians try to blow up the United States. And Nixon, I don't remember exactly what he says, but he's kind of like, that seems pretty bad.
Yeah, he's, and would our losses be acceptable, or what's the deal? He's pretty chill about it.
Yeah, and this gets back to something we mentioned on an earlier episode, which Watchmen doesn't get enough credit for. It's pretty funny at times, and I think, like, in a very dark humor way, but that scene is amusing.
Whoa, weird.
That was creepy, dude.
And it's fun. Covering these topics, America, Russia, Afghanistan, at least we're past that stuff. We don't ever have to go back and deal with these issues, these scary issues. We can look at this as a time capsule and something we'll never return to. Yes,
that's very nice, and I agree. Now, last issue was very focused on the comedian Eddie Blake. Given the grim humor, it occurs to me, do you think Alan Moore in any way identifies with the comedian? That he looks at this as like, this is a bleak wasteland and all you can do is kind of laugh at the truth?
I think so, yeah. He's definitely meant to be, he's the catalyst of this story, but he's also sort of the one who has almost the right take. He knows more than anyone else at the beginning of the story from what we learned last issue when he talks to Moloch. And that's why he's eliminated first, I think you could say. And it does feel like he's the one who's laughing at the world because the world doesn't make sense, which is... we're meant to think Dr. Manhattan's the hero, but he actually is the most vulnerable by the end of the story. And the comedian sort of is the most powerful, despite the fact that he died, because he knew everything.
Yeah. Now, there's a couple of different trains that are running in this particular issue. We get a lot more focus on Dr. Manhattan. We don't get his origin yet. I believe that's coming up next issue, but we find out more about him. Laurie ends up breaking up with him because he tries to please her with a threesome, but he is both parts of the threesome, and he's also working at the same time, again showing his misunderstanding of humanity. Eventually, as we say, he gets confronted with the irradiation, and it ultimately ends up with him leaving Mars. But the second part of the issue, the seemingly smaller part of the issue, is what's going on at the newsstand. Now, we've been talking quite a bit about how we reacted to Watchmen back in the day versus reading it now. I remember very clearly reading this issue and subsequent issues when they brought up the Tales from the Black Freighter thing. And at the time, when I first read it, I was like, oh, this is so boring. Oh, my God, shut up about these pirates. Who cares? But
they have nothing to do with anything.
Yeah. But reading it again and reading it closely, I feel very dumb about my past me because it's so clear that exactly what is going on in the Tales of the Black Freighter narration is the interior monologue or the interior feelings of the newsstand worker, even if that's not what he realizes.
Yeah. And just the world in general, that it's already, we're all already dead, and we're just sort of realizing that is what our lives are. Sort of, there's the grim take.
Turns out it's pretty good. Pretty good idea that dude had, those dudes.
Yeah, great dudes.
And speaking of, like, being dumber when you first read it, I mean, as a kid when I read this, women were kind of a little bit more alien to me, and I didn't understand why Laurie was so upset at him, because it just seemed like, well, he's just trying to please her in a way that I didn't quite understand. Like, threesome is a big deal, and, like, so he's multitasking. I didn't get it, but now reading this, it's like...
You were like, this is what sex is. It's it's a twins having sex with a person while their triplet works in the other room.
Exactly. Yeah.
Twins.
Yeah. By the way, how'd that go, Pete? Didn't you do that last week? You had sex with those two blue dudes.
Oh, it was great. Thanks for asking.
The Blue Band group, right?
Yeah.
One of them was doing the show in the other room, and you had sex with two of them. Was that nice? Did you have a nice time?
Yeah, we're still doing this bit? Okay, yeah, it was great.
Yeah, this is going to go the whole episode, Pete. We're not actually talking about the issue. We're just going to talk about you having sex with the Blue Bad group.
That's what the show is now, mostly. They did away with all the tubes and stuff. It's mostly live sex.
Yeah.
I tell you, it's the stomp was so much better.
Wow.
Yeah,
Unrelated.
You gotta have sex with Cirque du Soleil. Now that's a
that's where the real sex is.
I'm more of a have sex with a regular circus guy.
Oh wow. Old school.
I feel like
Yeah,
I
I'm
can't
sort of a
comment on
classic
that
dude.
because of real life reasons. We won't get into that though. Anyway, so back to the issue. So it does kick off with the Fallout shelter. It kicks off with the newsstand. What did you think in total? I know we just touched on this a little bit, but what did you think total of the Black Freighter section, the newsstand section, I guess kid? I don't know if it's a kid or young adult who's reading the Black Freighter.
Smoking, so you would think he's a young adult.
Yeah, I don't know. He's seemingly having a doob. Is that how you pronounce it, Pete?
No, that's not a doob. That's a cigarette.
A doob? A blunt? He's smoking a blunt?
No, he's not.
Some
I think
ganja?
he's just smoking a cigarette.
Some of that sweet green?
I feel like these are the first characters that we can just like.
Sweet green.
We can just like these people and watch them without having to figure out how they fit into the larger story. They feel very much like audience surrogates just sort of hanging around in this world, and some bad things are going to happen to them.
On the superhero comic bent of it, then, I do wonder if this is an effort to really spend some time with the literal people on the street, which is something that barely ever happened up until this point in superhero comics. Most of the time you would have somebody's getting their purse snatched, Batman comes in, saves them, and they're like, thanks, Batman, and that's the last you ever see the person. But here you really get to know these people, what they're thinking about the world, how they're feeling about it. One of them, to the point that you were making earlier, Justin, the dude who's reading the Black Freighter, he seems very interested in entertainment to the point of not really actually caring about what's going on in the world.
Yeah.
The newsstand owner, on the other hand, is pretending to be very jaded about the world, but ultimately he's actually very scared about it. So we do get to see what it's like in a superhero world from the ground level, which is something that later on, in a lot of different ways, we follow up. But first one that comes to mind is Alex Ross's Marvels that dealt with that in the Marvel Universe. So, I don't know.
Also, like, just the fact, I know we talked a lot about the shading, but like, when the guy with the sign kind of rolls up on those two at the newsstand, it's such an interesting perspective on the whole next page that it's very unique. It's from the point of view kind of the kid on the ground, you know? It's kind of like from the knees up, which is just such an interesting choice.
By dude who rolls up with the sign, you're talking about Rorschach, right?
Yeah, the end is nigh.
Right.
The end is nigh guy. Bill,
Yes,
the end is nigh guy.
We still don't know in the comic book, if you're reading it in order, that is Rorschach. Right now, we don't even know that his name is Walter Kovacs or anything like that, but that is him. I love the bit. It's just a couple of pages in where the newsstand owner is like, hey, I have your new frontiersman for you. And he's like, the world is going to end tomorrow. And he's like, yep. See you tomorrow? And he's like, sure will. And then he comes back a couple of panels later and taps him on the shoulder. It's like, you won't forget. And the newspaper owner spits out his coffee. I just think that's just a fun page in the middle of all this bleakness.
Little slapstick. I also think it's fun. You sort of touched on it where the newsstand guy he has such bravado about like, let's nuke Russia. And then that's literally what happens at the end, bringing all of his fears to reality, which is also what's happening in the Black Freighter comic. So it sets this tension with what the kid's reading, and then that becomes their actual reality like 15 pages later.
Yeah, and also the newsstand guy's like, yeah, most people just want entertainment, want to zone out, which is exactly what the kid is doing.
Mm-hmm. Now, let's talk about Dr. Manhattan and Laurie a little bit. One thing that I think you touched on earlier, Justin, that I think is really fascinating about this issue, because we get to see Dr. Manhattan is trying to do the threesome tour with, really to her, actually. He's working at the same time. Later on, Jenny Slater, who was maybe not his first girlfriend, but his pre-Dr. Manhattan girlfriend, as we find out later in the series, is dying of cancer and accuses him of it, and that causes him to leave Mars. What I think is fantastic about the way that, Alan Moore writes it, but also more so how Dave Gibbons draws it, is Dr. Manhattan is always very flat in his face the entire time, and his delivery is very flat, so you would think, like everybody accuses him of, he's disconnected from humanity. But as you brought up earlier, Justin, both Laurie rejecting him forces him to go on the interview show, and then Jenny rejecting him forces him to go to Mars. So really beneath that veneer of, I am above it all, I'm not human anymore, is a beating heart and a real sadness going on with him, I think.
Oh, yeah, and also just like someone who is his big vulnerability is guilt. Like he feels guilt about what he's being accused of, assumes it to be true without doing any sort of research, which you'd think he would as a scientist, because the guilt just overtakes him. And I think there's this great moment here in this panel. In the background, Laurie's sort of walking out, and Dr. Manhattan in the foreground, she's thrown a cylinder of liquid at him, and he reforms it to perfection as she's walking out. And just a nice thing that he can't fix humans, but he can always fix the cold, hard, scientific things around him.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of just talks about how he's so smart and so, amazing in all these different ways, but also it's such a loss when it comes to relationships and interacting with humans.
Now, the next thing that happens plot-wise here is that Laurie is kind of wandering along. She's not quite sure to go, but she immediately goes to Dan Dreiberg, Night Owl 2, to talk to him because they had a nice time the other night, and they commiserate together. Their relationship builds pretty quickly over the course of the issue. They end up walking together and getting attacked by a mob, a gang that I believe shows up later and throughout the comic book and throughout the series. But they clearly get a little hepped up by it and have a moment together. Before that, though, one of the most on-the-nose juxtaposition things happens pretty early on in their conversation, where there's a panel of Laurie saying, just shadows in the fog as the teapot spews steam and covers her face. She's blocked because Dr. Manhattan can't see her anymore. I just thought that was a fun little moment graphically.
Wow.
That's it. That's all I wanted to say. But what do you think about the Dan and Laurie relationship at this point? How are you feeling about it?
I mean, it's hard because she bounces back pretty quick, but it seems like he needs it pretty bad. Like he needs a win, so it kind of gets him back in his kind of groove.
Yeah, that's definitely what's going on with Dan. What do you think is going on with Laurie, though? Is she legitimately into Dan at this point, or does she just want somebody who is not Dr. Manhattan?
I think it's more of a subconscious thing where, like we saw in the last couple issues, he has been her escape to a more human, like the most like regular guy she knows. So
more
He's giving
more human than human. He's giving her exactly what she's missing, so she seeks that out. And I don't think it's a conscious, like, I'm going here to try to cheat on my husband, my space husband. I'm just I'm seeking out like a moth to a flame what I'm desperate for in my relationship.
There's another thing that gets very heavily into Dr. Manhattan's character when he goes to the interview where they say, it's going to be tough to pick up your color blue on camera. We'll have to figure that out. And he immediately makes himself darker. I think that is very much parallel with him trying to start the threesome with Laurie, where he's trying to please everybody all the time. He's trying to be this thing. And ultimately what he discovers is he can't be anything to anybody, and so he leaves, is what I take away from it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's true. Like he can solve these basic small problems, but the larger complexities of human emotions are the one thing that he just can't take in. He just can't see it. He can't fix it. He doesn't have it himself anymore.
Yeah.
Now, and it's also
ahead,
kind
Pete.
of interesting to see somebody so powerful, so vulnerable, and try so hard to do the right thing and have it completely blow up in his face.
Yeah. There's this fantastic sequence, we've talked around it a little bit, but as Dr. Manhattan is accused of giving multiple people cancer, Dan and Laurie are fighting this gang in the alleyway, and all of the narration is so on the nose with what's going on. You get to see panels of a crowd getting closer and closer and closer around Dr. Manhattan, squeezing him in as they change up the panel structure. As Dan and Laurie are just breathing hard, they're just going, and that's it. That's their whole dialogue, as if they just had sex, as if, even though, in fact, they're potentially about to. But there's the guard is saying, come on, let's get out of this mob. The mob's getting aroused. And then it cuts to Dan and Laurie. And then the same man says, let him through. He's not here to answer questions on intimate moments, as Dan and Laurie look at each other, realizing there's something between them. And then he says, gentlemen, I think it's safest not to pursue this line of thinking, as they move away from each other, as Dan and Laurie move away from each other, and Laurie lights a cigarette. Such a great sequence. So good on both hands. There's so many things going on in that. I thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, it's great. And I mean, there's a way to read this where maybe he's aware of that happening at the same time. He says alone in that panel right after they've sort of had their not sex but sex moment. He's like away and alone are emphasized. Like maybe he's aware of this all happening.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's definitely
that could
a big
be a
question.
reason like he's freaking out too.
Yeah. But then he gets back from the interview after he makes everybody disappear from it, and the whole world sees him essentially freak out. Where he gets back, and as we mentioned, we see the danger quarantine is on his room. And he's like, hey, you know what? We out. I'm out of here. I'm going to just real quick stop by Gila Flats, check out my picture of my old girlfriend, and then I'm heading to Mars. And he goes to Mars. After so much dialogue in the issue that we get 2 solid pages of Dr. Manhattan silently looking through Gila Flats and exploring the place where he was born before he leaves ostensibly forever, is fascinating just in terms of pacing.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so nice. It's such a great way to hyper focus. We've just been given a ton of information about this character, and to be able to let it wash over us at the same time we're watching him go through these same things. And you do see that he does have these emotions. He has the nostalgia, the full billboard we see as Laurie's running through the city. He goes back to the place where he was born as this new god hero, and he plucks the picture off the wall. So he's not completely dehumanized.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then the last couple of things that happen other than the Black Freighter stuff is we get to see Laurie come back to her room. Everything is being quarantined there, even her bra, which I think is, again, very pointed to the Dan Laurie of it all, that's being put in a canister for the time being. It's being put away. And meanwhile, Dan gets approached by Rorschach, who reveals to him that Dr. Manhattan leaves Earth. And I know this is something that I keep focusing on, but it feels very much to me like Rorschach is focusing on the wrong things, because he brings up that there are 2 of us gone all within a week, talking about the comedian murdered and Dr. Manhattan exiled. And there's sort of a connection there, but there's not exactly a connection there, right?
Well, but he's right. In the end, we learned that it was correct that this was connected, and this was all the plan of Ozymandias.
And
okay.
And it's also like partly Night Owl 2's fault that Dr. Manhattan left as well. So I think Rorschach, maybe not aware of how kind of spot on he is about that stuff.
I think that just speaks to his paranoia. He's not a logical thinker. He thinks the paranoid thought and then moves backward from there to try to figure out the clues, like many conspiracy theorists. So I think that's what it just happens that this time he's right, which I think we were talking about a little bit in maybe the first or second episode of this, how the sort of modern analog of Rorschach connects to some like QAnon theorists and like alt-right stuff.
Yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how they play that out in the show, and I know we've talked about this on the podcast as well, because they did come out and say that it is a very alt-right conspiracy theory thing. In the book, it's not that Rorschach is the hero. He certainly goes too far, and he does the wrong thing, and ultimately he's not the right hero for the time, as we find out at the end. But it does seem like they're going to go even farther with that on the TV show, so that should be kind of fascinating.
Yeah, it should be very interesting.
Last couple of things that happen, we get to see the newspaper man, as we mentioned, kind of realize how horrible things have gotten. He gives his hat and the comic to the guy who's been reading it the entire time. He essentially gives everything up that is his in a final analysis. And then there's another fantastic, I just love these sequences across the board so much, but like this Dr. Manhattan sequence, as he's walking across Mars, we get to see Richard Nixon talking to his advisors, and they're realizing, oh, well, Dr. Manhattan is off Earth, so we're going to kind of have to deal with this, how bad are the losses going to be. But we get to see, my favorite panel is they're talking about the nuclear cloud, and we see Dr. Manhattan walking across Mars, leaving a cloud of dust behind him, and it says, I'm talking total devastation. And there's so many things going on in that one panel where it's Richard Nixon and company talking about the total devastation of America. It's talking about the fact that Dr. Manhattan isn't there, so really America seemingly has lost everything. But it's also the total devastation of Dr. Manhattan's heart at the same time. And that's, again, so neat that there's so many things going on in those few simple words.
Also, there, his name is Tricky Dick, and you're seeing a blue dick there as well. So, there's that.
Yeah, it's a great connection, because a blue is a tricky dick. It's a trickier dick than a regular one.
Yeah. And also, you used to say that you could totally devastate a thermos of ramen, right? So that's going on as well.
To one other panel, like art thing, the panel layouts here, during this sequence and back with Janie Slater and Laurie, it's rather than the 9-panel grid, it goes from one larger panel, one smaller panel, so that it really feels like voiceover is running across these images, and it switches back and forth between the two different sort of sides at the same time. And it really makes that filmic quality just hammer home here. It's so well done. You really hear it over the action, just like you would in a movie.
Yeah.
Also, with the switching, when you have all the people wearing their suits, going through all of her stuff for radioactive things, like the fact that they kind of give you that whole thing so you see everybody in the apartment, like how crazy it really is. Because if you tried to break that up, I don't think it would be as powerful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Again, very good comic. People really should check it out. I hope they pick it up. Last couple of things. So we do end with this classic panel of Dr. Manhattan sitting on Mars all alone, which we get to see a couple of other times throughout the series. And then we also get another chapter or two. Is it 2 chapters? I think it's just 1 chapter of Under the Hood, talking about the end of superheroes. I love, again, how well these parallel this, what's going on in the story, but this is the most also on the nose one. I don't know why it is this 3rd issue that the juxtaposition hit me so hard that it felt like it was slammed even harder than the previous 2 issues. But here we're seeing the end of superheroes, the birth of Dr. Manhattan, as we're seeing, again, the end of superheroes, and not the death of Dr. Manhattan, but the end of Dr. Manhattan, at least for now, where he's leaving the planet. And I thought this was so nice to see the 2 things back to back, particularly because the Under the Hood sections are written so fun. Like, they're fun to read.
Yeah. Because it's a narrator that character doesn't really match with the rest of the story, so reading and hearing his voice, he's a goofy narrator.
I would also just like to quickly kind of point out, like, we went through a lot in this chapter, and just to kind of like have, him sitting there looking sad at us as we are kind of like sitting here reading the comic. I kind of felt like it was a little bit of a mirror, because it was like I was sad by like, oh man, you left everybody and you're just sitting on Mars by yourself
with a picture.
Yeah, when he's holding the picture, blocking his junk, and then kind of looking sadly at the
Do you think
reader.
that's what he's doing? He's looking, he sees you seeing him, and he's just like, oh, don't look at my junk.
Well, he was politely blocking it so the reader wouldn't be. But I don't know if it's like a fourth wall break, or if it's just kind of like this kind of like I'm feeling sad, he's feeling sad thing, you know?
It's funny that you say that. I interpreted it a little bit differently, because he definitely is looking at the camera. He's looking at the viewer then, but I saw it as he's looking out through the comic book panel and saying, hey, you going to drink those noodles?
It's really up for interpretation.
Yeah.
I think he's looking me in the eyes and is like, hey, what if two of me showed up at your apartment later?
Yeah.
I think he's looking at Zalbin being like, hey, you going to smoke the rest of that doob?
That sweet green.
Sweet green?
Man. Oh, I can't wait. We really got to wrap up this podcast, because I love getting high, and I can't wait to get high on marijuana after this. Guys, if you want to support this podcast, patreon.com/Comic Book Club. Also, we do a live show every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. at the People's Improv Theater in New York. Come on by. We'll chat with you about Watchmen. Pete, what do you want to plug?
Friend us on Facebook so you get to know about the amazing guests we have on our live show.
Follow us on Twitter at Comic Book Live.
And also at Watchmen Watch 1. You can also follow us at Watchmen Watch Podcast on Instagram or on Facebook. You can subscribe, find out where to subscribe at comicbookclublive.com. And remember, we taped this podcast 35 minutes ago.
Oh, I didn't notice, but Alan just texted me. It was more of a letter from 1985. He said he'll definitely be there next week.